The Untold with Heidi Buzo. In today's episode, we will be talking about Iran and its continued malign behavior in the Middle East region, the maximum pressure campaign that has significantly weakened the regime, yet the regime continues its assault on the Iranian people, ordering the executions of 3 young men for peacefully protesting. We will also talk about Hezbollah's threats against Israel and the attacks against U.S. forces in Iraq. Finally, we will also be talking about the so-called strategic partnership that Iranian regime has signed with the Chinese Communist Party. Joining me to talk about all of this are Micheal Pregent Senior Fellow at the Hudson Institute, and we are also joined for the first time by Behnam Ben Talebo, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you so much both for joining me today. Thank you so much, Mike, for making it. I do want to kind of sidetrack for a moment here and just mention that, Mike, you were tested positive for the COVID-19 and you're now better. And I'm so glad to see that you're doing well. You're the only person that I know that was actually tested positive so far. How are you feeling?
Yeah, great. I mean, what I had was I had a mild fever and a headache. I went and got tested. They did the x-rays for the chest because that's the first thing they're concerned about is what your chest looks like. Chest was fine, blood levels were fine, breathing was at 97%. So literally I was released the next day and just told to self-quarantine. So for my experience, I didn't lose taste, I didn't lose smell. I took a shower. It was about a 4-day period where I had a low-grade fever and a lingering headache. But there was no cough, no sore throats, nothing like that. And basically, the worst part of it is 14 days of, stay away from people. And that's a pretty lonely experience. I love being by myself when it's my choice. But when it's kind of forced upon you, it was a little bit tough to deal with, I got tired of watching TV, got tired of doing things like that. But during the first 4 days of this fever and this dulling headache, I didn't really feel like opening up a computer, didn't feel like doing anything other than just kind of resting. So that was my experience with it. I'm on the other side of it. The doc said, you're fine. And now I'm one of those individuals that has had it, can talk about the experience. And again, it was nothing that was crippling. It was nothing that,
So you are one of the lucky ones who actually were dealt fine with it. Your body reacted.
It's good. I'm glad I got it, to be honest with you. I'm glad I got it. I'm glad I'm where I'm at. And, the majority of us are going to be the lucky ones. Let's just be realistic about it. But it's good to have it out of the way. I was doing a lot of traveling from Utah to New Orleans, and I did catch it in New Orleans. New Orleans had a bit of more of an open society during this coronavirus shutdown. And, it's exactly like they say, don't be close to somebody, don't be in a loud bar, listening to music where people have to raise their voice and get in your face a little bit. And, just be smart about things. And I'm glad I got it. I'm glad
we're very glad to see that you're doing well and that you are doing much better now. I mean, you look great. So we will say that this virus that came from China definitely has affected the world, and it's not really going away as soon as we were hoping for it to go away. We know that the numbers are actually on the rise again. Let's start with our discussion for today. Now we know that yesterday what happened, there was 2 US F-15 airplanes that were on a routine air mission as part of the US Central Command, and they conducted a standard visual inspection of the Iranian airline Mahan that was flying in Syrian airspace at a safe distance. But the reaction of the pilot, and there was videos, and the Central Command, the US Central Command, also issued a statement explaining that this was a standard procedure that was done according to international standards. Can you tell me your opinions about what does this mean Is that a shift in U.S. policy towards Iran airplanes flying in that space? And, we know that even Mahan Airways, even if it has civilians, they do carry a lot of things in those airplanes. What are your thoughts about this? Whoever wants to jump in.
I'll start real quick. We know about Mahan Air. We know that the IRGC has used it to transport Fetamayoun fighters from Afghanistan. They come into Iran, they get trained up, and then they get flown into Syria. The evasive maneuvers taken by the pilot should actually demonstrate that, or should indicate that this was not a civilian airliner that was basically conducting a routine domestic flight into, was this the one that was going into Damascus, or this is the one that going into Beirut?
This was going to Beirut.
Okay. Yeah, but it was flying over Syrian airspace.
Over Syria.
So these evasive maneuvers, again, these pilots are part of the IRGC. There was probably intel that, you can normally see one of these planes land, and you can see fighters get off if there's imagery available, or if there's a drone footage available. You'll see fighters get off of these aircraft. And I think this is probably based on intelligence. The U.S. conducted this routine flyby, and the pilot basically confirmed that, hey, there's something nefarious going on here, and that's why we're taking these inappropriate, unnecessary, evasive maneuvers that actually injured some of the passengers. Anyway, that's my take. What do you think, Ben?
What do you think, Behnam?
Yeah, I got a couple different levels to this. One, of course, is that the U.S. has the right and actually has patrolled not just the land around the Tanf garrison in southeast Syria, but the air around it as well. Technically, that space, the 50 or 55 kilometer deconfliction zone, is not just off limits, for Iran. It's also technically off limits to Russia. And even a few years ago, the U.S. used military force to enforce this deconfliction zone on the ground. The U.S. struck Shia militias there back in 2017, even. So the U.S. has acted to enforce this red line before. Everything Mike is saying seems totally routine. There is this plane that enters a deconfliction zone. U.S. sends jets to actually go investigate. The jets actually keep about, I don't know, was it 1 kilometer distance? It was reported. They keep this distance. They get close enough to make a visual confirmation. And then what Michael said happens, which is like after the planes get close, the plane gets close enough to this Mahan airliner, which is in essence owned or controlled by the IRGC, has continued flights at coronavirus peaks to China back in February. Is known for ferrying not just men but also munitions across the region. Is sanctioned, has had multiple operators across the world sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury as well. So it's got all these telltale signs. And then what does the pilot do? The pilot begins these either evasive maneuvers or also just grossly unprofessional maneuvers. There was, I think, 1 or 2 videos or 1 picture and 1 video from inside the plane. I didn't see them in full, but I read what they contained in English language press reporting. And it just seemed like there were passengers. Who knows what the freight of the plane actually contained, if it was civilian cargo, civilian and or military cargo, who knows? But nonetheless, there is this history of these planes actually carrying it. And worse, the evasive maneuvers, I think it dropped 14,000 feet in 4 or 5 minutes, actually injured several passengers on board. I'm sure it freaked out tons of people on board too. It just shows that it was exceptionally unprofessional behavior. And the fact that it actually ended up going to its destination, not harmed by US jets, but actually harmed by the pilot, kind of confirms this longer standing, broader narrative the Trump administration has been saying about Iran, which is the longest suffering victims of the Islamic Republic are the Iranian people. If you're flying Iranian airlines, you're also a long suffering victim here. So the plane should not have crossed in terms of the airspace over the garrison. The plane should not have responded to a routine visual inspection in this way, but the fact is that it did. I think it's another accidental flashpoint. You've seen these sort of flashpoints in the Persian Gulf where the US Navy acts in an exceptionally professional manner and the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy doesn't. So probably they've translated that policy from the seas to the skies.
I mean, yes, the United States, the U.S. Central Command said that this is to make sure that the safety or ensure the safety of the 10th garrison. But is that also an indication of a change of policy about the freedom and ability of Iran to use that airspace to transfer weapons, ammunition, etc.?
I mean, I hope that the garrison's airspace has been routinely enforced, like the land deconfliction zone around it was. At least that's what's been reported. We know that overflight is really the IRGC's preferred way to bring men and munitions into Syria and Lebanon. Of course, there's this land bridge as well. It's got at least 2 or 3 routes from Iran, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon. Mike knows about that. He's spoken about it at length. But there's been obviously overflight too, and in the normal world, in the practical world, redundancy is a dumb thing, is a bad thing. In the military world, redundancy is a good thing. It gives you options. So the IRGC has these land routes and air routes. So one only hopes, and I do hope, that one of the larger purposes of maintaining these forces in the garrison in Southeast Syria is to actually block the IRGC's advances. But the way the debate, as you know, is going ahead about Syria here in the States, particularly in Washington, it doesn't seem to be moving towards a more permanent presence there, or it seems to be doing less for less, not more with less. And that's very unfortunate, because that's one of the things we can use to kind of prevent Iran from surging into the Eastern Mediterranean.
But there were some reinforcements of U.S. personnel in northeast Syria. We know that there were some actual reinforcements of the troops and not vice versa. So what does that tell us? Is that maybe a reversal in the policy, maybe postponing the idea of leaving Syria?
I feel like Mike would know better for that region than I for northeast Syria, but I would just say, in my view, I think unless you're actually blocking one of the 3 main transit routes, you're actually there for a different mission, which is the original mission, the counter-ISIS mission, the coordinating with the Kurds in Syria mission, perhaps helping deny the Assad regime territory or slowing the Assad regime's advance, perhaps something vis-a-vis Turkey. Of course, there's interest in the administration's potential partnership there. But as it relates to the counter-Iran mission, not the most important piece of territory. I think Tanf is far and away the most important piece of territory.
Tanf is the most important piece. What would you think, Mike, about a possible change or maybe postponing the older policy, which is that we need to leave?
Well, I think
Syria.
Listen to both the Biden camp and the Trump camp. You're hearing language about ending forever wars and keeping a low footprint to deal with ISIS. So we continue to give Baghdad the opportunity to show that it's a partner in this fight against ISIS, and we're not seeing that based on ceding control of the Al-Qaim crossing and also Abu Kamal crossing and the Al-Tanf crossing. So you have Al-Tanf or Al-Tanf, and then you have Al-Qaim and Abu Kamal, which are basically the Syrian side and the Iraqi side of the border, and the militias are controlling that. And this is, again, an area where the United States, after a rocket strike by Kataib Hezbollah or an attack on the U.S.-Iraqi counter-ISIS mission, that's where we respond. We respond at Al-Qaim. We respond at Abu Kamal against Kataib Hezbollah infrastructure on the Iraqi and the Syrian side of the border. We're still going to be in the ISIS fight, and that's we're making sure that we maintain good relationships with the YPG and the KDP Peshmerga in Iraq, in case we need that local partner force to go after ISIS. We're going to maintain a relationship with the counterterrorism services in Baghdad to go after ISIS. But again, the biggest threat to the U.S. mission in Iraq is not from ISIS; it's from the militias tied to Tehran. The biggest threat in Syria, again, are these Iraqi militias that are moving into Syria that are trying to destabilize the Levant. Under the counter-ISIS fight, I think a Biden administration or a Trump administration will continue to use intelligence, special operators, and local partner forces to go after ISIS pockets that continue to emerge. But there's less and less of an appetite to use strong power, smart power to deal with the militias in Iraq. U.S. government, DOD, is not willing to cut off funds to the MOI, the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Defense, where we've seen penetration of these militias tied to Tehran. And the Biden administration saying they're going to jump right back into the JCPOA. The good thing is we know people that will go into the Biden camp if they're elected that view Iran as a serious threat and know that you have to renegotiate from a position of strength. And the best part about JCPOA 2 under a Trump administration or a Biden administration is it will be a treaty. It will be 60 votes in the Senate. I know I'm kind of breaking off here, but that's what this is all about. It's about curbing Iran's regional activities, stopping ballistic missiles, ending sunset clauses. And there's bipartisan support for that because the Obama machine, the charismatic Obama machine that was going to primary Democrat senators if they opposed the Iran deal, is no more. Biden is not Obama. If you listen to Chuck Schumer and Menendez, they want an Iran deal that looks a lot like the Korea deal they've talked about, meaning no sunset clauses, address ballistic missiles, no sanctions relief ahead of breaking down.
I mean, and I think that we will talk about that possibility a little bit later in the episode, but I do want to ask you about Iraq. So the Khatami and his government, there are some people who are hoping that they will be more confrontational towards the Iranian militias. There were some threats from Iranian militias against Khatami, and we saw the assassination of what happened to Hisham al-Hashim and all of the tragedies that continue to happen to the Iraqi people and the control and the domination that we see from the Iranian-backed militias. But are you hopeful about the ability of this government to actually confront those militias? Is this a possibility, or are those hopes are just not based on facts and the realities on the ground don't support this theory?
We have to remember that the militias aren't simply wearing uniforms on the battlefield. The militias aren't simply a militia force outside of government control. The militias form the largest voting bloc in the Council of Representatives in Iraq. They approved of Prime Minister Khatami. Even Abu Fadak, the leader of Kataib Hezbollah, came around and approved of Khatami's position as prime minister. So I look at it this way. They approved of him. Qais Khazali approved of Khatami. Ismail Khani, the leader of the Quds Force, approved of Khatami. Nasrallah of Lebanese Hezbollah approved of Khatami. Why? Because they're not worried about him. Let's remember, when there had been detentions of Kataib Hezbollah in Iraq, within 48 hours, they've been released under immense pressure from Tehran, under immense pressure from the Fatah movement, inside of the Council of Representatives, and Khatami has caved every time. Understand, a commander-in-chief is only as strong as his support within the Council of Representatives. He's an interim prime minister that's supposed to be there to shepherd in new elections, and the elections would actually replace and marginalize all of these political parties that are the militias. Remember, the Fatah party is Kataib Hezbollah, is Asab al-Haq, is Badr. And if they hold new elections, they'll lose power. So he's basically been neutered. The counterterrorism service that conducts these raids have put themselves at risk. They've been doxxed. Their names have been leaked to the militias. And the militias are basically, anybody who is detained is released. So you have a counterterrorism service with US special operators going after these militia members. They capture them. They put themselves at risk, only to have a political interim appointment in Prime Minister Mustafa Kadhimi release them within 48 hours. And after killing Hisham al-Hashim, okay, we know who did it. It was Kataib Hezbollah. Abu Fadak ordered it, and then
and nothing has been done yet. Absolutely.
Yeah, Abu Abdul al-Askari was the guy who oversaw the operation, and both remain free men with power, not only in the Hashim al-Shabi, the PMU movement, but also in the Council of Representatives, based on their influence inside of the Fatah party. And Khatami is powerless. I mean, Khatami went to Tehran. He was summoned to Tehran. He didn't go to Tehran to complain about Tehran's influence in Iraq. He went to Tehran to assure it that he's not going to go after the militias. And we got to just wake up. It's embarrassing how hopeful we are when it comes to Baghdad. And we've been hopeful for 18 years now. And we've been disappointed each time. And it's only become worse. Iran's influence has only grown. It hasn't diminished at all.
So Iran, in your opinion, its influence in Iraq has only grown. What do you think, Behnam? We also know that there was a German activist who was actually abducted and released today. What is your impression of what's happening in Iraq? And obviously the continuous threat of Iranian-backed militias against US forces.
Well, the threat is first and foremost, not just the U.S. forces. It's really to anyone who supports the stability, sovereignty, or territorial integrity of Iraq. Iran has used the post-2003 Iraq War period to puncture not just the Iraqi state. Mike is talking about the Ministry of Interior, Ministry of Defense, the security forces, the Hashd-e-Shabi, all of that, but then also economic institutions, religious institutions. There's all this debate about how personalist has the Hawza and Najaf become. How much of an institutional check can they be on the Khomeinist interpretation of political Islam after, potentially there's the passing of Ayatollah Sistani, for instance. There's all these things that Iran has not won the top tier battle for, but they've began to backfill the lower tier individuals. And that's how they've encroached on the Iraqi state. That's how they've encroached on Iraqi society. That's how they've encroached on Iraqi politics for so long, for 18 years, as you guys were mentioning. I have a slightly different view about Khatami. I'm willing to give him a little bit more time. I'm willing to give him a little bit more space. This is just one view. The reason being, you don't even see Iraqi prime ministers before try to thwart Katyusha attacks. At least 2 Katyusha attacks have been thwarted. We want to actually see if any of these tracings that they say they're going to do, I don't know which ministry in the government is going to carry it out, obviously, but tracing to see which militia provided which munition, publicizing this information for the coalition first, and then for the American and Iraqi public second. We don't even have this time yet. It's a welcome change that they're doing these, arrests or raids of Kataib Hezbollah. But as Mike just mentioned, what good is a arrest or a raid if 2 days later, 3 days later, those same individuals are allowed to walk free? So I think Khatami is sending an important signal, but in that signal where he's trying to project strength, his weakness is also being revealed. It's not his personal weakness, it's his institutional weakness. I think Khatami personally, just based on what we hear and what we read, would have loved to give Tehran an earful. But the reality of the situation 18 years after the US invasion of Iraq is that you can't have an Iraqi prime minister that can easily, for lack of a better word, give Tehran the finger, because it doesn't know what the status of US forces in its country is going to be. It doesn't know what the status of American commitment to Iraq is going to be. And we're seeing this with longer standing partners. We're seeing this with GCC countries with whom the US has actually moved much closer to since the Trump administration, kind of forsaking traditional European partners on Iran, moving closer to the GCC states, which bear the brunt of the Iranian threat in the region. And as the US is intensifying its maximum pressure campaign, some GCC countries are actually inching towards Tehran because they're afraid of the escalation risks. And if we see this kind of hedging behavior from our longer standing partners in the region, what do you think a state like Iraq is going to do, which is as punctured as Mike is saying? So
who are those GCC countries that are getting closer to Iran?
Well, there's always been discussion about Oman-Iran ties. Since the Qatar split within the GCC, Tehran has been trying to use instrumentally Qatar as a cleaver between itself. But there was this tripartite of hawks as well: Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and UAE. And what you really saw since the downing of the drone, and I know this is a shift from Iraq, and you and Mike were just talking about Iraq, so forgive me for this shift, but
no, it's okay.
Since the downing of the drone last summer, you saw the UAE incrementally inch towards Tehran, and there's a couple measures for that. There's the withdrawal of the official forces of the UAE in Yemen. There's the the maritime deconfliction dialogue that happened admittedly at a very low level between the UAE and Iran. And there's ongoing reports about UAE-Iran trade, which is still, in my view, sanctionable. And I think by the letter of the law, sanctionable. So, you have these sorts of activities going on, which does not even serve, in my view, the national interest of the UAE, which has put a lot of time into talking about this Iran threat. And then you have this other kind of activity. But this other kind of activity is hedging, because they'll probably look and they'll say, okay, well, if the US didn't defend its own drone with kinetic force, how is it going to defend us? And this is exactly the kind of impression that Iran is trying to give. Remember, this is a throwaway line Rouhani gave, but it was so meaningful. Last September, Rouhani went to the UNGA. He said one line in Arabic in the rest of his Persian speech. And that one line was, first the neighbor, then the house. He was basically doing this to intimidate the GCC. Adar thumma ajar. First the neighbor, then the house. He was saying, you guys are trying to secure your house by inviting America into the region. When you invite America in, you create more instability. This is Iran's argument for 41 years. This is the argument they're using to have hegemony in the region. They're saying, no, no, you bring foreign forces in to protect yourself from us, you're actually making it worse. So why don't you kick out all the foreign forces and we can handle everything together, just as friends and neighbors and partners. And this is exactly the impression they're trying to give. They want to create the conditions where there's a unilateral American withdrawal. They want to create the conditions where, as Mike was saying, both the Biden camp and the Trump camp, or really lots of the kind of new generation of thinkers on both sides of the aisle in DC, see the Middle East this way as simply being not worth it. And once that impression solidifies from a talking point into actual policy, that's when Iran is going to be vindicated. That's when they're going to say, aha, we were the more patient partner. We were this, we were that, and we are more reliable. America isn't. And that's when they'll use military force more than they're doing now to press their advantage, where if you disagree with them, they're going to do more overt stuff versus covert stuff against you in the region. And as we begin to minimize our interest there, they're going to start maximizing their interest. And it's going to happen at a whole series of times, like Mike was talking about, with nuclear capability, with sunsets, with American withdrawal in the region, with more hedging by Arab partners in the region. And it's a very dangerous package when you look at it from 50,000 feet.
Yeah, and it's interesting what you said, Behnam, is that we'll threaten our neighbors first, and then we will also, second, we'll be threatening our own people. So this has been the policy of the Iranian regime. But what we're seeing also different in Iraq today is the people of Iraq are just rejecting the Iranian presence on every level, specifically the Shia majority that has been more vocal than any other sect or ethnicity. Would that also apply pressure or give the support that Kadhimi needs to be more aggressive? And I know that, Mike, in your opinion, he's not showing the kind of leadership that you would hope, or the Iraqi people would actually hope to see, especially after the assassination of another loved Iraqi activist and commentator, Hisham al-Hashimi. But in your opinion, also, does that apply more pressure on those militias that they don't even have the base that they've enjoyed once?
70% of Iraq's population is under the age of 30. This is the first time where the whole country, to include Sunnis, Kurds, and now the Shia youth, are saying, you know, Iran Bara Iraq Huda, you know, Iran out, Iraq is free. And they're very disappointed in Kadhimi. So if you listen to the Iraqi youth, they're disappointed in Kadhimi because he said he was going to go after the ones that killed protesters. Remember, Kadhimi was the intelligence director when Qasem Soleimani took over a national security meeting and told the Iraqi government, sidelining Abdul Mehdi, putting him in a chair across the room, and told him how to kill protesters. Kadhimi was in the room. He was the intelligence director. Kadhimi was in the room, or Kadhimi was the intelligence director when these militias attacked the US Embassy. Kadhimi was the intelligence director when they launched rockets against the K2 mission, and Kadhimi said it was ISIS. And, you know, I'm not hopeful, Ben. I wish I could share your optimism on Kadhimi telling us that the militia rockets are going to actually belong to Kataib Hezbollah or AAH, but there's there's a default position that continues to emerge. Well, that was Daesh. I'm sorry, ISIS is not in the Dura neighborhood of Baghdad, which is an AAH stronghold. It is not in these areas where these rocket attacks are coming from. If Kadhimi comes out and says, yes, this was a militia attack by Kataib Hezbollah, it will be words, and we can applaud it and say, that's great. Now, what are you going to do about it? We have this defund the police movement in the United States. How about defunding the militias? They're actually killing protesters. They're disappearing protesters. They put political pressure on this government, and they have access to, and nobody cares. And that's so unfortunate. They have access to US intelligence, US training, US equipment, US funds, and somehow we're buying into this narrative that if we strengthen the Iraqi institutions, it'll counter Iran. The institutions have been co-opted. The MOD and MOI are border-controlled entities. The Hashid al-Shabi are border and Kataib Hezbollah-controlled entities. And in that, they got exactly what Iran wanted. They finally have a political party, much like Lebanese Hezbollah, that has a majority voting bloc that can decide what this commander-in-chief does. The prime minister can be outed in a vote of no confidence. Kadhimi, again, It's easy to say, great job as the intel director during the ISIS campaign. Way to go after the scourge of the earth. That does not mean he's going to go after militias tied to Tehran. And it's a naive qualification. I've met the people inside of the National Security Council in the White House that say that, oh, he's a great guy because we knew him as the intel director under the ISIS campaign. Well, he was also the same intel director, again, I'll repeat, that did not provide the US with early warning about the K2 attack. They killed Narwaz Hamid, an Iraqi American translator, who was the liaison and interface between US special operators and Iraqi special operators to go after ISIS. He did not warn the US of the attack on the embassy. He criticized the US for attacking Kitab Hezbollah bases. We have to remember who he was. He was Maliki's choice to be intelligence director. Then he stayed under a body, and he stayed under Adel Abdelmehdi, and now he's the prime minister. He sat in every meeting that had a focus on putting down the protest movement, killing protesters, disappearing influencers, disappearing Sunni males from Jafar Sucker, and then renaming it Jafar al-Nasser, to put that sectarian name on a Sunni town south of Baghdad. This is the prime minister. Doesn't matter that 5 Americans like him. The Iraqi people know that he's not going to go after the people that have killed protesters, that he's not going to go after the militias. Tehran's not worried about him. And the president and Biden would be correct to say, halas, let's get out of Iraq, because it's a failed experiment. We do not have a partner. We do not have a government.
He would be right to say that? I'm surprised to hear that.
Absolutely. There needs to be a disfavor campaign for Baghdad. We could stay there. We could stay in Iraq like we are in Syria under the UN mandate to go after ISIS. We do not need Baghdad's permission to be there. And the more Baghdad continues to disappoint, there's no appetite. There's no interest in staying in Iraq in the House of Representatives, in the Senate, in the White House. And there's going to be no interest under a Biden administration. And
but isn't this a national interest of the United States to maintain this presence? Because what we've seen before is when we pulled out of Iraq, ISIS came to life. Iran became the dominant force. The Middle East doesn't leave us when we leave the Middle East. So this has never been a actually functioning or a successful strategy.
I'm not saying we're going to stay out of it. I'm saying we're going to recognize whether or not we have a partner. And we do not have a partner. Remember, Baghdad grew an Iranian militia threat. The US ISIS campaign grew an Iranian military threat to the point where we had to take out Qasem Soleimani. We had to take out Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes. Why did we take them out? Because there was intelligence that the embassy was next, that they were going to seize the embassy, take American hostages, use those hostages for sanctions relief. Now, show me the proof that there was an imminent attack. Well, that's not how intelligence works. Intelligence does not work that way. Gone are the days of we have a wedding package for the groom. That stuff's gone. Gone are the days where like, hey, listen, this is Qasem Soleimani's plan to take over the US embassy. The way you confirm intelligence today is based on the smoke and fire that follows an attack.
Okay, do you want to comment on this, Behnam, before I move?
On which aspect? On the future
on
of
the
Iraq,
aspect of talking about the U.S. engagement as a whole, having a partner or not, because this is a national security interest of the United States to be in the region.
I think Mike and I agree that the U.S. has to be in the region. I think where we disagree is the method and the way we engage either with states in the region or the way we keep forces in the region. Ultimately, Mike is right when he's talking about the House of Representatives, the Senate, because Mike and I testified, I think, 2 years ago together, both of us recommending sanctioning Iran-backed militias in Iraq, just based on the evidence. And we didn't mention 2,000 militias. I think we mentioned 3 or 4 or 5 militias. Not a large number of militias, things that you could, through the open source, very kind of public domain information, tie these groups to these bad actors, either the Iranian state or the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. And obviously, the people in Congress were not particularly interested in hearing the word Iraq for a very long time. They were not really interested, and it took the administration a while to even begin to incrementally designate some of these, not all of them, designate some of them. And this just tells you, like Mike was talking about, the political appetite. No matter the strategic interest that you, me, and Mike may agree on about the need to push back on Iran in the region, there's also the political reality of this town. And I think that experience is what Mike is drawing from when he's saying, like, look, there is no appetite, there is no this, there is no that. So I think we need to be creative, both in terms of the law to make sure we're conforming with US and international law, both in terms of US national interests and the national interests of our partners, to be able to do more with less forces in the region. Mike was talking about Syria being a potential example. I don't know how well that example translates to Iraq. I still think Iraq is worth fighting for. I still think the reason Iran has been so obsessed with puncturing Iraq state, society, politics, military is because of the experience of the Iran-Iraq war. Well, guess what? We had our own Iraq war too. That was a harrowing experience for the US. Mike actually fought in that. He served in that conflict. He knows what that's like. I don't think it's worth being able to cede the politics and the institutions of that country just yet. There may come a time when this slow, steady snowball Mike is talking about ends up falling off the mountain, reaching the ground and hitting reality. The question is there a way right now where you're talking about this kind of majority Shiite anti-Iran sentiment inside Iraq being married with a US pressure policy that is not just pressure for the sake of pressure, but smart pressure? Some forces, some sanctions, incrementally adding the sanctions, helping win elections, helping strengthen, perhaps not institutions first, but a couple of politicians to be able to deliver on things like an independent judiciary, Iran out of Iraq, following up on assassination campaigns, tracing where some rockets are actually fired from, rather than lie or rather than cheat or rather than abscond. I still think that's a work in progress. I still think that's something worth doing. And I still think for right now, that's something that can be accomplished without more blood or more treasure. Something that is going to require more treasure is actually if you take a more expansive view than even I take, which is to support the Iraqi state. Because given low oil prices, given Corona, the Iraqis don't even have the budget necessary to begin to carry out some of the things that they want to carry out. And the question is, if people in Congress or people in DC are kind of sick and tired of Iraq anyway, and we have our own Corona issues here, and there's a whole pivot to the way we look at interests in the region, do we even have the capability to care or provide the Iraqi state with these resources? So we may agree on the Iranian threat. The question is, what other priorities do policymakers in DC have? And it just kind of seems like, again, Mike was talking about both sides of the aisle here, that there is a slow, steady divorce of Iraq being a priority for a lot of Americans in public life. And I think for me, that's sad, given the blood and treasure, given the time, given the commitments, but also given exactly what you just said, Havi, which is the overarching national interest and national security argument for the counter-Iran policy, because that begins in Iraq. The reason the Trump administration deserves credit in 2017 compared to the Obama administration is because it said it needs a regional approach. That regional approach to pushing back on Iran has to begin in Baghdad. If it doesn't, I don't know where it can even begin.
I did talk about the fact that the Iraqi people are fed up with the Iranian presence. The Syrians have obviously been, because Iranian regime and its militias have helped Assad destroy the entire country, obviously Russia as well, and also in Lebanon. And we see the protests that are happening. And the impression is, even on the ground, is that Israel got it right, because Israel is the only country that's been confronting the Iranian-backed militias. And Israel is doing this because those militias are encroaching on its borders. They're threatening Israel, but they've continued to have airstrikes against Iranian-backed militias. There was one a few days ago where there's reports of an IRGC general that was killed in those airstrikes. Hezbollah did confess to losing one of its commanders as well in Syria. Hezbollah has been very active in helping the Assad regime, has committed mass atrocities in Syria as well, along with the other IRGC-backed groups. But in your opinion, what does that mean, the continuation of the Israeli policy of confronting the Iranian-backed militias in Syria?
Mike, can I go first on this briefly?
Yeah, absolutely.
Just in Syria, the Israeli policy has been, military first, right? They've been using, as you said, military force, not to solve the problem, but to slow the growth of the problem, which is, first Iran building bases, then Iran bringing forces to be co-located in those bases, then Iran training, and then Iran, actually using Syrian and Iraqi territory to kind of transit men and money and most importantly munitions, particularly precision guided munitions, particularly this whole project that Iran has to turn Lebanon's rockets and the missiles, basically turning something without a guidance system into a guidance system. And they're kind of trafficking. They've gone from building large buildings in Syria to actually trafficking things the size of a small suitcase, which makes that the intelligence mission for the Israelis much harder to actually accomplish. But nonetheless, given the news reports of more airstrikes, it seems like they're still able to accomplish that. What this means from a policy perspective is that, first, the argument that using force in a limited sense against Iran or its interests in the region is actually out the window, because there was always this argument before in DC that if you use force to push back on Iran even a little bit, it can lead to a potential World War III scenario. So I think what the Israelis have shown persistently is that you can significantly erode Iran's interests and capabilities in the region with military force without begetting a larger gross chain of escalation if you prove to your adversary that you have resolve and are determined to win any escalation cycle. I think the Iranians in Syria understand that there is a real cap to what they can do. And there is another actor, perhaps a little bit less as much less effective, but has also been using military force against Iran or an interest of its, and that's Saudi Arabia. With the way the war in Yemen is continuing to shape up, let's not forget, on the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, Saudi Arabia led a coalition to begin to use military force to push back on an Iranian interest there. However, it looks like the longer that war is going on, the better Iran is about being able to actually exploit divisions in Yemen. And in the past 9 months, there were 3 intercepted shipments of Iranian weapons going to Yemen. So this narrative of using the military to be able to push back on Iran in the region is important because it shows that it can work. We only discovered those weapons going to Yemen because they were interdicted. They were actual ships physically present to be able to take these anti-tank missiles away from potentially the Houthi recipient. So there necessarily requires a military solution to some of these problems. There is no way to say that it doesn't, but that doesn't mean that a military solution has to be some kind of gross region-wide kinetic conflict. If Iran is signaling through pouring more men, pouring more money, pouring munitions, and pouring more national reputation into a theater of conflict, it's telling you that that theater of conflict is important to it for strategy and ideological purposes. And very few things are able to be used to disabuse an adversary of something like that other than meeting military force with military force. I think the Israelis have so far got the cocktail right in Syria. I think Iraq is a whole different ballgame, which is why you saw much less Israeli strikes there. Is this translatable for the region? I don't know. But this argument that you can't use force to push back an Iranian interest is torpedoed by the way the Israelis have been doing so successfully in Syria. And I think that's worth keeping in mind, regardless of the level of U.S. engagement in the Middle East moving forward.
Michael, I want to ask you, in your opinion, there is also the Kherdad missile program, the Iranian missile program called Kherdad, that also Israel vowed to not allow them to be stationed in Syria. There are the Hezbollah threats on the northern borders of Israel, and Israel is doing this on its own, but could the United States also be helpful in this continuous threat against Israel, and the fact that Iran, as Behnam just said, is really interested in maintaining its presence and in reinforcing its militias, because this is a vital, probably insurance for the regime moving forward?
I think one of the greatest miscalculations and the biggest disappointments that the regime has is in Russia's decision not to protect Qasem Soleimani's land bridge against Israeli airstrikes. The Russians aren't interested in that. Israel has been able to hit these sites with impunity, conducting 6- and 8-hour air campaigns against these static sites, and it's led to protests inside of the Majlis, inside of Iran. I think, what is this relationship with Russia? Why do we have one? How is it beneficial to us if they're not going to protect our forces in Syria? Russia has no interest in protecting an offensive capability by the IRGC Quds force and its militias. We've seen Lebanese Hezbollah and Israel conduct face-saving gestures across borders in order to ease tensions. These are always good signs. We saw Iran do it after we took out Qasem Soleimani, these face-saving gestures just to kind of de-escalate. So Iran may believe that it can do that, but one of the things we haven't talked about yet is China. and this new Chinese
We
agreement.
will be talking about that.
I know I'm not saying we're not going to. I'm just saying it's a big deal. And the one thing that we're looking at is that China's not only in Syria backing the Russian mission. China's not only in Iraq forcing gas and electricity contracts on Baghdad with Iran. And now China's looking to inject, $400 billion over 25 years. It's not a lot of money. I'd like to talk about that when we get to it. But Iran is not the strong conventional force. It's a special operations force. Charismatic leader is gone. Ismail Khani is not Qasem Soleimani. He doesn't have that relationship with the Arabs. Doesn't have that relationship to the point where they've actually outsourced that to Lebanese Hezbollah to maintain the relationships with the Arab militias that Ismail Khani just doesn't have. So I think there's a lot of optimism, meaning Israel can conduct these strikes and the United States can help with intelligence and simply by greenlighting these attacks. Remember, the Obama administration did not greenlight Israeli attacks on IRGC, Quds Force generals, or Qasem Soleimani, and the Trump administration said, have at it. And Israel has been able to conduct successful cyber attacks against Iran, successful sabotage attacks against Iran inside the mainland against its nuclear program, against its missile program, and has been able to conduct airstrikes with impunity while Russia sits on its hands and won't even think about using S-300s or S-400s to interdict Israeli aircraft. And I think it's a demonstration to Iran, listen, you have an untapped economy that the world's interested in getting into, but we're not interested in facilitating your offensive capabilities. We're not interested in facilitating your hegemonic goals. And I think there are going to be some constraining events that will force Iran to do different things from allies that it didn't expect to have a say on what the regime does.
That's very interesting, and it's actually very important. But I do want to to continue the conversation about the U.S. policy towards Iran, the maximum pressure campaign that definitely proved successful against the regime. But the Iranian people are also continue to suffer at the hand of the regime. We know that there were 3 Iranian protesters that were sentenced to death just for peacefully protesting against the regime. People had a hashtag that went viral on Twitter, Edam Nakid, I don't know if that's how you would read it, Behnam. And the regime is continuing to oppress the people, being very monstrous against its own people in every way. COVID-19, the Wuhan virus, is spreading in Iran like wildfire. So what is the way, in your opinion, we know that the Iranian people are suffering. They do not want this regime to stay in power. But with this maximum pressure campaign, is the regime weakened to a point where there is hope for the people inside of Iran to one day maybe topple the regime? This is what they're hoping for.
Well, it's an excellent kind of package of problems that you presented, because there's interest for U.S. policy, interest for Iranian policy, interest for the Iranian people. And they're all going in different directions here, because let's start with the maximum pressure campaign. Mm-hmm. And let's face it, when you look at the 12 points Pompeo has mentioned, only one of them deals with what's going on inside Iran. And that's the one that deals with foreign hostages. So the maximum pressure campaign, if it's really designed, as per what the administration says, to get you those 12 points, and those 12 points are what a final deal with Iran could look like on things Mike has mentioned, nuclear, regional, missile, terrorism, everything. Human rights and domestic reform are actually not part of those 12 points. And that's why those 12 points are actually more of a security policy change. They want, the government of Donald Trump wants Tehran to change its foreign and security policy. So if the maximum pressure actually achieves its stated purpose, those violations, unfortunately, would be continuing. And one would hope that the Trump administration would continue to use sanctions and pressure to punish ongoing Iranian human rights violations. But that's why, actually, the maximum pressure campaign is not aimed at regime change. It's actually aimed at behavior change. And, people like me have said, if you're going to be using these powerful economic tools of coercion and punishment, you should actually integrate some of those human rights concerns into this larger pressure policy. Because if you're only going to give this one shot, if you want a deal that is genuinely comprehensive, it's best to also take the biggest actor, who happens to also support you, by the way, the Iranian people, and integrate them into this policy. Very interesting that the type of protests we've seen in Iran while Trump is president, but also while pressure has been building from 2017 until present, has been not, more pro-reform protests, but really just genuinely anti-regime protests. There's a whole new cadre of slogans and chants. The slogans are inherently more nationalist in their disposition. The protesters are inherently more blue-collar people protesting. They're not, upper middle class people from Tehran. They're not people who are part and parcel of the reform movement. The real issue with these protests is that they are continuing to signal that they don't want this regime to be in place, and they're actually beginning to target things that we care about to prove it. They're talking about Iran's foreign and security policy. They're saying, not Gaza, not Lebanon, my life for Iran. They're saying, forget Syria, think about us. So they're targeting the way Iran spends its increasingly limited money abroad to make a point about the government's priorities. And what really matters for a good government here is how they order what their interests and priorities are. And nothing tells you that better than Corona. Under the coronavirus crisis, we all talked about with Mike before, the continuing IRGC operated air flights to China. We just talked about now the China trade deal. Iran actually trying to silence its own spokesman in certain public ministries in the country who actually did point a finger first at China. The regime is using this virus, the coronavirus, to actually tighten the reins inside Iran. There's more executions. There is more online repression. There is actually no sign of change at all in their foreign and security policy. So as they're hit with corona at home and sanctions from abroad, the regime is maintaining this level of deep foreign involvement. And that tells you that they're continuing to put revolutionary ideology over national interest. And this is one area where the US and the Iranian people are actually together on this against the regime, because they have a different set of priorities. The Iranian people have a fundamentally different set of priorities. And we're living in a world where particularly this administration in the US is best predisposed to be able to say, hey, Rouhani, hey, Khamenei, you are failing to put Iran first. And what an amazing source of pressure that would be on the regime from abroad as well. Just even that narrative, that talking point. There's things now in Iran that are so sad to hear, given the rank ordering of priorities and interests under Corona. Things like medical students being forced to take 1 year, or I don't know how many semesters in universities in Iran of traditional medicine or Islamic medicine. And then when you go back and look at some of the things that people have said are traditional medicine responses to coronavirus, they include putting a violet oil soaked cotton ball somewhere in the human body. They included drinking camel urine, very odd, grossly unscientific things. So it's very unfortunate that this is the direction the government wants to lean in, that when you have less resources, the first thing you want to do with those less resources is to increase the number of women you're harassing and arresting because they're not properly covering their hair on the one social media platform, Instagram, that you haven't blocked. This shows their true colors. And this is totally separate from US policy. This is what the government of Iran is choosing to do with its limited time and its limited resources. And the continued protests, even under Corona recently, you had protests in February, you had protests in May, and you have very sporadic protests, I believe, in the south, in Behnam, a few days ago. And they're continuing to tell you that they're sick and tired of the way this regime prioritizes their interests. So while moving forward, there will be more economic triggers for protests. People will be upset about high costs of petrol and bread and the cost of living and disappearing banking savings and the diminishing value of the rial relative to the US dollar. They'll be talking about all of these things, but they'll be using those economic concerns to make a political argument. And the political argument is that 41 years later, the Islamic Republic is one of the biggest social science experiment failures in the modern Middle East history.
Michael, in your opinion, and that's an important point that Behnam mentioned, is that the people inside of Iran are continuing to suffer, regardless of the maximum pressure campaign that is weakening the regime abroad, but the pressure on the people is continuing. And we know that this regime has caused so much suffering to the Iranian people and to the entire region. What is the way to move forward with this regime to basically help the people inside of Iran maybe find the way forward, maybe topple the regime, which is what they hope for, which is what we see the hashtags online? Is that a realistic view or hope for people? Because this is what the region really hopes for in general.
That the United States, regardless of who wins the presidency, will be in a position to continue maximum pressure. The Biden camp may call it something else, but these sanctions that have been put in place by the U.S. Treasury are not simply going to be something you can come in and just lift. It's not going to be as easy as that. And there's going to be a robust debate inside of D.C. on any future Iran deal, so we don't have the mistakes of an Iran deal where it was either this or war, a weak deal or war. We know what war with Iran looks like. We've been at it for 40 years. It's a series of provocations and hopes for concessions, economic concessions, any sort of favored status. What I love about the protest movement across Qasem Soleimani's land bridge from Tehran to Baghdad to Beirut is it's led by a constituency that Iran took for granted, the Shia youth in Iraq and in Lebanon. And of course, its own people. This regime does not own Iran's history. A 40-year regime does not own Iran's history, and that's a beautiful thing. This is a small period of time that this regime has been in place. What can the U.S. do? I believe that all we need to do is put a spotlight on the human rights violations, continue to do that. And, we see more of an appetite by the U.S. government to go after China for human rights abuses now with the Uyghur community. And with China dipping into the Middle East as we dip out, I guess the good thing is it's going to keep us focused. It's going to keep us there because we can't simply go to this great power competition narrative that says, okay, let's leave the Middle East and focus on Russia and China when Russia and China are in the Middle East. And they're actually, filling in the gaps, the voids of a U.S. shift in foreign policy. So it'll force us to get back in there. But the good thing about Iran is it's a mismanaged economy. It's $400 billion. And this deal with China will only advantage China. Even hardliners are saying this is bad. There's not going to be an equal relationship between Iran and China. It's going to be predatory. China's going to take advantage of things. It's going to flood Iran's economy with cheap Chinese goods, killing an entrepreneurial, innovative economy that can build its own microwaves, build its own cars, build its own tanks, its own rockets. It can do a lot of things from a TV, a microwave, to a rocket. And that's going to go away. China's going to say, no, that's our goods are coming in now, cheaper goods. And it's basically an injection of $18 billion over 25 years. You cannot float a $400 billion economy with $400 billion over 25 years. The majority of it's going to be up front. It's going to go into infrastructure that will facilitate China. They're going to upgrade Iran's gas and oil infrastructure to hijack it, to take advantage of it. And they're getting discounted oil. And the most important thing about Iran, and I'll defer to Ben on the specifics here, but what I know is that Iran needs to export 2 million barrels of oil a day to sustain a bad economy. And they're at about 500,000 right now. And China has now decided to get the majority of its oil from Saudi Arabia. And then it's Russia. And then it's Iraq. And Iran will just be something there for reserves in the future. But it'll also probably be a leverage position for China to work with the United States on a future trade deal. So again, China is pragmatic. This new relationship with Iran, this military partnership, it's not going to be the Chinese Navy facilitating the IRGC's Navy hijacking of oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz, where 32% of the world's oil goes through when it's being shipped by one of these big oil rigs. China's not in that business. Russia's not in that business. Russia disappointed Iran by not providing a military capability that would benefit Qasem Soleimani in Syria, and China's not going to do it either. But I would love to hear Ben's take on the Chinese missiles that would upgrade the IRGC, and would actually cause a threat, because I still think that China's not interested in that either. They're interested in hijacking an economy. And I think if you're listening to moderates, I mean, I know we use the word reformists and hardliners, they're both against this China deal, because Iran wants to be on the same status as Russia and China. And Russia and China do not look at Iran as an equal partner. They look at it as a desperate economy, mismanaged by a theocracy. And they're going to take advantage of it. And remember when the Russians launched Scuds from Iran into Syria over Iraqi airspace without the permission from Tehran, they shut it down. They said, you can't occupy a base, launch Scud missiles without letting us know. And whether or not that's true or not, those Scud launches stopped. Russia was not able to conduct those operations from Iran anymore. The Russian...
I mean, I do kind of want to keep talking about the China question, because as you mentioned, Mike, this is now a deal that they were talking about, and they actually agreed on, called long-term strategic partnership. And basically, Iran is desperate, wants to sell what's left of Iran's economy and resources to whoever, is there to buy. And in an op-ed, Undersecretary of State for Economical Growth, Keith Krach, and Special Envoy to Iran, Brian Hook, they both basically said that even before the pandemic, China was not spending money in Iran. And there's no reason for them to do that now with all of the economical sanctions. What is your opinion about this? Because, this is the last thing the region would need right now, is having another evil dictatorship come into the region with all of what comes with it. And we know about the human rights violations of the Muslim Uyghurs that are continuing in China. So what do you make of this new so-called deal?
Real quick, Ben, and then I'll pass it over to you.
Yes.
Iran was supposed to be somewhere different 5 years into the JCPOA. Remember, at the beginning of the JCPOA, if you looked at 2020, Iran was supposed to be an economic powerhouse because sanctions were lifted and Europe could invest inside of Iran. Our partners in the JCPOA were not in the Iran deal to keep Iran from becoming a nuclear power. They were in the Iran deal to take advantage of Iran's economy. But Russia and China were there for gas and oil rights and military contracts. So this agreement actually goes back to 2016, where it was first agreed upon that they would talk about it. And this is China's attempt to shore up a bad investment. There has been a terrible return on investment because of the Iran deal, because of what the regime did when it squandered its opportunities. I would argue that if the regime didn't step up ballistic missile testing, didn't increase regional behavior, didn't create new militias, didn't provide lethal aid to the Houthis to start a military destabilization campaign in the peninsula, that we would still be in the Iran deal, that we would still be in the JCPOA. We left the JCPOA because of those other things. And I think China's very disappointed. Iran was supposed to be ready on October 18th, 2020 to purchase Chinese equipment, purchase Russian equipment, to be an economic powerhouse, now a conventional military force. And at the end of sunset clauses, a ballistic missiles after 8 years. So 3 years from now, they could start doing ballistic missile testing. And after the sunset clauses, literally put a warhead on top of a ballistic missile and be in compliance with a terribly flawed JCPOA. Something that Rob Malley continued to say, hey, listen, that's not the case because we renegotiate everything in 2028. Well, anybody who knows the Iranians know that if the Iranians are in a position of strength, they're not going to concede. They're not going to give concessions. They're going to continue to ask for more. And that just didn't happen. So Iran did not become the economic powerhouse. It does not have this spending, this capital to buy things. And Iran simply going in to just kind of shore up a really bad investment and guarantee discounted oil for 25 years.
What do you think, Behnam? I mean, also at the FDD, hold on, I'm going to say his name correctly. Saeed Ghassem Menejad, is that correct?
Yes,
your colleague wrote also about the fact that despite the deal, the Chinese imports from Iran are actually reduced.
Yeah.
Yes, plummeting. So I do want to kind of hear your perspective about this potential change or investment that some people are really downplaying. But I mean, what what are the expectations there?
Well, let's go macro to micro, because the last thing we really hit should be the future of this Chinese trade deal and why China is doing less and less, at least on the books, with Iran. But Mike mentioned two very important countries, and they relate to the U.S. because these two countries are mentioned in the national security strategy and national defense strategy as being great power competitors that the U.S. is going to be dealing with, and that's Russia and China. And when you look at Iran's relationship with both countries, it's not a real alliance per se, it's an unequal partnership. And both Russia and China have used Iran instrumentally, and I use this phrase, very interestingly, as a pawn in their larger game of chess against the West. Iran is a pawn you sacrifice at the right moment. You build it up, you move it out, and that it's going to fall at the right moment. So what does that mean? When you look at 2010, for instance, when you had the toughest Security Council resolution against Iran, Russia and China signed on to that. And ultimately, it looked like the Russians got something from the Americans, which was a little bit more distancing of a missile defense site in Central or Eastern Europe. That was something that the Russians were able to get from America. You move this site a little bit further away, we'll support you on Iran. And ultimately, the Iranians are there thinking that their Russian partners are going to cover for them, and they're not. The Russians have taken more territory away in the past half millennia, the past 500 years away from Iran than any other country in the world. And Iranian nationalists and Iranian people, as Mike was saying, the regime doesn't own Iranian history, remember that. And so that's why in 2016, when the Russians were staging bombers in Hamadan Air Base, a famous air base that actually a coup against Khomeini was led from in 1979, 1980, that's why the Iranian people actually got upset. That's why there were debates in parliament. That's why people kept bringing up lines, even from this government in Iran's constitution, about not being able to stage foreign forces in your territory. Iran, ever since it really took it being itself a bad actor to level 10, 11, 12, when it really turned up the fire on its malign activities, even its partners like Russia and China couldn't cover for it anymore. And Mike is absolutely right to talk about the JCPOA here, because Russia and China just wanted Iran to muddle through so they could actually re-enter the Iranian economy much more forcefully. The Russians, they've done a lot for Iran's nuclear program, its missile capabilities, and some of its military capabilities, particularly after the Iran-Iraq war. They helped Iran modernize a couple of systems. They helped Iran purchase some systems. The Chinese also have done the same, but the Chinese also have been interested in buying a lot more Iranian oil. And whether you look at the Obama era or Trump era, in the pre-deal or post-deal era of both presidents, China has been the largest licit and illicit purchaser of Iranian crude oil and other petrochemical products in each iteration from 2011 to present. But since the return of the latest iteration of sanctions in 2018 and then added to in 2019 with the oil ban the US has had, Chinese trade, Chinese investment with Iran has actually gone down. Perhaps on some other raw materials, it fluctuated in a couple months' time. But overall, as Saeed says, and as the data says, China doesn't believe like Iran is worth fighting for. But that doesn't mean China isn't going to use Iran instrumentally. China is a card they can play exactly in trade talks, in debates about where forces could be in the Persian Gulf, in debates about how some of these countries in the East are moving further west from the Indo-Pacific into the Persian Gulf. There's all of these debates that China is going to use its relationship with Iran as a pawn, as a bargaining chip in its larger strategic competition with the West. And this is really why it's so ironic that on the plaque of the foreign ministry of the Islamic Republic is a slogan from the revolution. And that slogan is Na Sharqi na Gharbi Jumhuri Islami, neither East nor West, an Islamic Republic. The whole thing was, we're not going to be West capitalism. We're not going to be East communism. We're going to be an Islamic Republic. But 41 years of an Islamic Republic and being so anti-West has kind of forced them into this Eastern camp. And nothing shows it more like than the uneven deals between Iran and Russia and the very uneven deal between Iran and China. It is going to flood Iran with cheap goods from China. Mike is absolutely right. It could form into a much larger strategic partnership. But because it's a source of domestic pressure on the regime right now, I think it's something we need to keep our eye on. There's lots of academic literature on nationalist protest, even in authoritarian countries. We could see that happening in Iran. Much of the literature that exists on how nationalist protest actually makes for a tougher Chinese policy line down the road. Well, what if that happens inside Iran? What if there's nationalist protest, but the government of the Islamic Republic, because it's so dependent on these foreign outside countries, Russia and China, can't meet that domestic nationalist demand? Guess what? Another cleavage, another data point of where state is here and the society is here. You add that to the 41 years of grievances between the state and society in the Islamic Republic, and it's a highly combustible scenario. So this is one area where I think at the macro level, the US and the Iranian people, again, are on the same side. They don't want these other rival great powers getting retrenched into the region. They don't want Iran to be a chessboard for great power competition between the East and the West. But the Islamic Republic's obsession with this ideology, the Islamic Republic's obsession with carrying out all this revolutionary foreign and security policy that Mike was talking about, has even led some of these Eastern countries, Russia and China, to look at Iran and say, what the hell are you doing? And to be able to have Iran literally over a barrel, take advantage of them. And the Iranian people are tired of that. Those investments that Mike was talking about, that China is going to be doing, that modernize Iran's rail, road, and oil export infrastructure, that immediately benefits China. That helps China's Belt and Road Initiative. That helps connect Iran to infrastructure China has built across the Persian Gulf and South Asia already. This is a real problem where if you're an Iranian patriot and you're looking at the direction your country is going in, you should not be happy about this. And that's why you even have people in the regime insiders who are not happy about this. The question is, how will this flashpoint feature between the US and Russia and China in Iran when it's actually implemented, when the weapons start flowing in, when the money starts flowing in? Because right now, in the short to medium term, it's not. But if the arms embargo is not extended, and if the Russians and Chinese sense there's a new president and the new president signals something about relieving sanctions, then maybe the data that my colleagues are citing and that exists in these trade databases will change, because maybe market forces will change and political risk-taking will change. And China and Russia will feel even more confident, not just using Iran like a pawn, but to borrow from the chess metaphor, using Iran as a rook or a bishop or a knight against America. And that means looking at what systems they transfer. That means looking at what capabilities they give. And again, it produces a very highly combustible scenario. We
can't even rely on the fact that if we have a new administration with different policy, that this will change either. We know that those forces of, authoritarianism and dictatorships, they usually work with each other. Having a softer policy or a tougher policy doesn't necessarily change these kind of overall directions that we've been seeing. And you mentioned an important point, and you wrote about it too. We know that, for example, the COVID-19, the Wuhan virus, is spread in Iran because there was those connections, and they continue, and the spread continues. The regime in Iran doesn't care about its people, refused any aid to help them with the spread, even though the United States offered to help with medical supplies for the Iranian people. The Iranian people are not happy with a deal like this. This is obviously not something the United States wants or anybody else in the region. But what do you think is the right approach for the United States to confront such a deal? I want to start with you, Michael.
Well, I think there's a new appetite, at least in this administration, to go after China. China is isolated in the international community because of the coronavirus, because of its response, because of the lack of transparency. And we're looking at moving U.S. supply chains. We're looking at moving the U.S. relationship to one where it advantages the United States. And I would just talk about real quick, in 2012, it was the EU and the U.S. that put crippling sanctions on Iran to bring it to the table. If you look at U.S. sanctions alone and compare it to the 2012 economic metrics, U.S. sanctions alone have the regime worse off than it was in 2012. So the U.S. position, again, we've shown an appetite to sanction Chinese companies, sanction Chinese individuals. China may actually put itself in a position where it's held responsible for the actions of the regime when it comes to human rights violations inside of Iran. It's bypassing U.S. sanctions by doing this, by injecting this $400 billion over 25 years. It's just whether or not an administration has the appetite to go after China's economy. But again, China's more isolated now than it has been. I mean, if you look at what Great Britain is doing, or the UK is doing with yeah, exactly.
Huawei, yeah.
Yeah, Huawei. I was like, looking the way it was spelled. You know, China's been hurt, and you know, it's China, Russia, and Iran that are isolated here. And again, if you listen to Brian Hook, if you listen to Secretary Pompeo, Russia and China vetoing any position by the U.S. on the arms embargo will have consequences. It's not going to be a consequence-free vote by Russia and China. It will have, there will be ramifications, U.S. sanctions if Russia and China go that way. So at the end of the day, what you want to do is we want to make Iran's economy so toxic that it's just not worth it to a $1.9 trillion economy in the Russians, and of course China's economy, to put things at risk because of a failing economy in Iran. But again, it's whether or not this administration is, so the Biden administration wins, they're going to have a huge domestic focus. I don't think they're going to use a lot of their political capital up front to secure a new Iran deal, one that's going to have to be a treaty. And they may take a back seat to the Middle East, and they take a back seat to everything that's going on, and going to Ben's position where Russia and China see an opportunity. And I love the analogy that Ben uses, the chess analogy, to change Iran from a pawn to a bishop or a rook, something with more of an offensive capability, something able to counter the U.S. position in the Middle East. But again, the one thing that I like is Russia values its relationship with Israel and Saudi Arabia as well, and China does as well, probably greater than its relationship with Iran, just based on the purchasing power of those economies and based on their favored status with the United States. Russia and China are not going to be sanctioned for doing business with Saudi Arabia, sanctioned for doing business with Israel, sanctioned for doing business with our Sunni allies in the region. We still need to take a look at that because, you know, we know Russia and China are in there to take advantage of the situations, to take advantage of schisms, to take advantage of instability. But just one quick segue back into the China-Iran thing. When China builds something, it doesn't hire locals to do it. It doesn't stay on the local economy. It doesn't eat on the local economy. It brings in its own workers, which will probably be a lot of this Uyghur workforce, to build something. They have a camp on the site. They eat on the site. They build it, and it's built for them. It's built to mirror their capabilities in China. Just like Ben said, they're going to be able to take advantage of it. And there will be no economic benefit to the Chinese presence in Iran other than one that benefits China. And, you know, that's consistent across the region. When they build something in Saudi Arabia, they do the same thing. They build it and they leave. You never knew they were there except for the fact that it went up. And it never benefits the local economy.
And they implant their own spying gadgets within
Absolutely.
it too.
Everything's there to, again, this intelligence sharing that's going to take place between the regime and China is concerning only that it's not going to be intelligence sharing to find the next Baghdadi or to go after Al-Qaeda. It's basically on U.S. troop movements in the region, U.S. military capabilities. But as a former intelligence officer and a former military officer, we're pretty transparent on what we're doing in the region. We will do a press release on the deployment of a 500-man battalion to an area or an air defense system that we're putting in place. So there's really not a lot of intel that we're going to be able to say, oh my God, I can't believe the Chinese figured out that we're actually moving a Patriot system into northern Iraq to deal with the militia threat. Because those things are just easy to do. Easy to find out. The more concerning things would be, you know, sharing that intel on U.S. troop movements with militias and then providing them intel to do things. But they already have access to intel through the Iraqi government, the MOD and the MOI. I know I talked about a lot of different things there, but it's a very interesting place to be an American. And one of my biggest criticisms of U.S. foreign policy and national security is that everyone currently in a position within DOD and the Department of State, we're looking at Iraq and Iran, we'll be working something else 2 years from now. And it'll be a new set of Americans introduced to this problem set. And the institutional knowledge is out here with people like Ben, with people that have been looking at Iran for a long time. So it's important for those of us with institutional knowledge to try to make people smart on this problem set. The problem is whoever gets there first becomes the baseline for their thinking on Iraq, Iran, Syria. And after that, you're just trying to penetrate a narrative that they bought into with facts. And Ben and I can both testify that when we testified, it was very difficult to try to convince people to sanction entities that were in violation of US law, whether it be Global Magnitsky, whether it be the Leahy Law, whether it just simply be killing Americans. And it's because there's no institutional knowledge inside the decision-making apparatus of the United States government. It's all based on experts having to inform them. The problem is the baseline is a baseline group that basically says everything is complicated, everything's complex. And when you hear that and you tie that to government, that means inaction. That means the government's not going to do anything about it. These are excuses for inaction once an expert throws in, this is complex or this is complicated. It's almost an excuse to not do anything and just to write out your 2-year term to get out and then bring another American in. And it advantages Russia, China, and Iran because the same negotiator has been sitting there for 20 years dealing with 17 iterations of Americans in Iraq, 20 iterations of Americans in Afghanistan, and they just build up a playbook and they can take advantage of it. And we keep using terms like hopeful and let's give them more time. Let's see what they can do. That's the playbook. They want us to fall into that default position of being hopeful and waiting to see what happens because they can write out a 2-year term. They can write out 2 years of a Secretary of Defense, 4 years of a president. And we're in that waiting game now, 3 months ahead of an election where they're just waiting out Americans to see what comes next. And it's an advantageous position for our geopolitical competitors and our enemies.
Yeah, very important what you were just saying, Michael. I do want to ask you, Behnam, because the U.S. presence in the region is also viewed positively by the people in the region. And I think this is very important for people who are listening to me here, Americans and people who are listening to our podcast and to our viewers to understand that people in the region do actually see the U.S. presence as their insurance, as the way to kind of confront their enemies, such as the Iranian regime, the Assad regime, the Islamic extremist groups. So, it's important that just to point this fact, because some people talk about the U.S. presence abroad as if it's a negative thing, but this is not how it is viewed in the Middle East. And it's very important to kind of talk about this. But in terms of confronting China's attempt to come into the region, through a deal with Iran, what do you think the appropriate American response would be at this point?
Well, I think America should take a stratified response to the Chinese growing engagement in the Middle East. And let me just, before I answer that, say just that, Mike, thank you. It's very, very kind of you to say that. And likewise, we've been through a lot of iterations of talking to different people on both sides of the aisle on Iran and Iraq. And he is a reservoir of institutional knowledge himself, particularly having served in Iraq. So that's Mike, so I really appreciate that. Thank you. And that is a challenge that I think some of our authoritarian adversaries don't have. Meaning they do build up this institutional knowledge, but they also build up in-country knowledge. When you travel around the world, you realize a lot of America's allies and adversaries, they spend a lot of time learning local language, local customs, sometimes just to figure out how to penetrate, to get a little bit of a better deal, to get a better military deal, to get a better economic deal. And I think that's certainly true of the Chinese in the Middle East. They've taken that effort. They've studied U.S. missteps in the region. And now they feel a little bit bolder. There was a long time in American foreign policy history where you would talk about China hiding behind a Russian veto in the Security Council, that Russia was always willing to challenge America and that China was more timid. But growing Chinese investment in the Middle East has necessarily meant more Chinese political and military interest in the Middle East. And when you have more political and military interest in the region, you are not going to be timid about it. That's why when Pompeo was talking about extending the arms embargo at the UN Security Council, one of the more vocal opponents of it was China. In some ways, the Chinese opposition kind of outshouted the Russian opposition. These are marked shifts in the way these two great powers are looking at their interests in the Middle East. And one of the things we have to be careful about, because you mentioned, U.S. forces staying or leaving, is this vacuum effect, that there is a political effect of an adversary like Russia and China coming into a region and basically being able to plant a slightly taller flag, at least for public relations purposes, where a U.S. flag once was. And I think that's exactly the kind of impression that these states are trying to give. They're not building domestic capability. Mike just talked about how what they're building is really for themselves. But they're trying to create this impression that they dislodged America. This feeling of wanting to dislodge America is not just going to be unique to them, though. In Shia militia terms, like 2010-11, when they saw the U.S. leaving, there was an uptick in rocket attacks and mortar attacks. And if we have some kind of withdrawal from Baghdad or elsewhere in Iraq today, you're probably going to see a similar uptick in these attacks, because they want to solidify this impression that we drove America out. This is what the Islamic Republic is all about. When they took over the U.S. embassy in November 4, 1979, days later, Khomeini said that famous phrase, which continues to animate so many revolutionary policymakers in Iran, which is, America can't do a damn thing. That all you have to do is push a little bit at the right place at the right time. America can't do a damn thing. That's their whole point. And the way Russia and China have been incrementally deepening their involvement in the Middle East is to test the waters. Can America do something? So now is the time with the trade deal for America to say, actually, here's what we can do. And it's more than a damn thing. One is to stand with some of the local partners. Two is to deepen the military engagement in the region, particularly when it comes to shared threats. Some GCC countries actually want to pay to sustain the US presence there for a longer term. That's a totally different debate when you look at US forces in Northeast Asia and places like Korea and Japan, and US forces in Central Europe when you look at Germany or elsewhere. These countries actually want to pay us to stay there. That's important. Next, we're deploying assets to places like Iraq that are CRAMs, that are Patriots, that are not just good for US forces, they're also good for this burgeoning infrastructure inside the country. So what's protecting us is also protecting them. So it's, again, shared interests here. The next thing is to be able to, at the mid-level, to hold hostage what Russia and China want from us. If they want dollars, if they want better economies, if they want better products, if they want better inputs, if they want better market access to our allies, such as in Europe. It's good US diplomacy that could make the UK, as well as, of course, the UK realizing itself that having Huawei become the leader in 5G in that country is not a good decision. Now, France has taken a different approach, but this means that the US needs to focus political and economic efforts on having France engage in a similar flip-flop. You want to be able, if it really is great power competition, you want to hold hostage that which the other side values dear and continue to threaten it, because it's already a zero-sum game. Iran is not, the Islamic Republic of Iran, I should say, is not a friend or partner of the US. The Iranian people are, but the Islamic Republic of Iran, the government is not. So that's a zero-sum game. The Chinese are partners of Iran. The Russians are partners of Iran. So let's offset some of those partnerships. You think you're going to have growing engagement in the Middle East and Europe at the same time? No, you're not. US diplomacy, US economic interests in Europe can be used. The US can help bridge this transatlantic gap, whether it's a term 2 Trump or a term 1 Biden. Bring the transatlantic community together against some of these countries. There are fears of Russian encroachment in Europe. There are fears of Chinese market encroachment in Europe. Let's build on those to have a more united front against some of these great powers. It doesn't have to be a necessarily military response. All that has to actually happen is, if there is one threat from one of these countries in one region, we can respond to it in another region. So it has to be this flexibility, because if you're going to apply to the Iran arms issue, we may not necessarily through sanctions alone be able to stop certain technologies from flying from Beijing or Moscow to Iran if the arms embargo is not extended in 2021. Some of those defense contractors in Beijing and Moscow simply don't care about having market access. It's a very different kind of game. So we have to be better about threatening that which they care about. And this is what the US policy community and US intelligence community needs to do, to come up with the areas of interest and the areas of convergence with Russia and China, and to be able to realize when they do X, we have to be able to respond with Y. I'm sure there are people who have done this already, but it has to begin to be implemented. If China does something that's low level in Iran when it comes to investment, we have to see, well, what kind of other investment by China can we offset in South Asia, in Europe? Can we hold hostage the funding to this? Can we delay the funding to this? Is there a lawfare component to this? Is there an international public relations campaign to this? If we put a spotlight on something, will it slow the progress of this? There has to be like an endless series of basements of policy options to every time one of these countries moves deeper and deeper and deeper into an area where the US has spent blood and treasure for more than 4 decades. It can't come without a cost, because if it does, then a country with the strength of Russia and China is going to begin to tout the Khomeini line, which is America can't do a damn thing. And you don't want those two nuclear powers with their major economies and their risk-taking abilities to begin to act like the Islamic Republic of Iran, where they always believe America can't do a damn thing. America can't do a damn thing. You don't want that. So that's why you respond early and often to lower level threats.
Lastly, can I ask about the arms embargo? This is my longest podcast so far, but I do want to ask about the arms embargo. Please, both of you, if you can comment a little bit about the ability of the United States extending this arms embargo in 2021 against the Iranian regime.
I promise I'll be brief and not super long, but listen, the U.S. has to multilateralize its max pressure campaign. Mike talked about how successfully we've done things unilaterally. Now is the time to do it diplomatically and multilaterally. What that means is you got to be able to actually use the UN system to collapse elements of the deal. And you have to be able to say that, the Europeans, you want multilateralism? This is multilateralism. You cite a threat from Iran, we're here to cite the same threat with you. And they should actually use the UN process. Now, if all else is equal, it's highly likely that the US, if it uses the UN process, is going to fail, is going to actually get vetoed out by the Russians and Chinese. And that would put the US in the position to actually have to do what Brian Hook and Pompeo have talked about, which is once the small component of the deal is not permitted to be extended, the arms embargo, to get the full benefits of going back to a 2010 world in terms of Security Council resolutions, you need to snap back. And that is going to cause some problems on the Security Council, but it's something that the US has said it already is willing to do. If Iran is not going to become a modern military power overnight, but it is going to get some of the military hardware that it needs from these countries to begin to selectively modernize its weapons industries. Yes, it's a domestic arms producer, but also when it gets 1 or 2 tools from abroad, those tools become hugely important in its national security doctrine. Iran got one kind of liquid-fueled medium-range ballistic missile from North Korea in the 1990s, the Nodong-A. They ended up calling it the Shahab-3 when they reverse-engineered it. That became the baseline for all of Iran's liquid-fueled medium-range ballistic missiles, all of which are capable of carrying a nuclear weapon. And this weapon, to boot, became the prototype based on what we know about the clustering of engines and rocket staging for Iran's satellite launch vehicles as well. So this one weapon became the gift that kept on giving. Another example, in 2001 from Ukraine, Iran illicitly got land attack cruise missiles, the same kind that actually was banned by the INF treaty, the KH-55. That was an air-to-ground one. Iran converted it for a land attack, so ground-to-ground or surface-to-surface. And then Iran not only reverse engineered this at home, but proliferated it to the Houthis. So there's a whole challenge here of procurement, production, proliferation. So it's not just Iran getting something from Russia and China. It's what capabilities can Iran get from Russia and China to export to its partners and proxies in the region, as well as beef up its military at home. It's a much broader threat.
Thank you so much both for this very informative and enjoyable discussion to me, to listen to your expertise on this very important topic. Thank you all for listening and watching to the Untold with Hedi Bouzo. I would love to hear your thoughts and comments about our podcast, and see you next week.